October 1968. A candlelit chapel on a private Greek island, rain outside, and two children holding ceremonial candles while their mother marries the richest man alive. America called it a fairy tale ending. Within days, aboard his yacht, the bride wrote a private apology to another man, a letter later stolen from a Manhattan law firm and printed in the papers. The groom's mistress of 11 years found out about the engagement from a newspaper. 6 years later, he hired Roy Cohn to make the divorce as humiliating as possible for her. He never got it. She got $26 million. Start with what the country was told, because the country was told almost nothing. On the 17th of October, Jackie's mother, Janet Auchincloss, released a short statement from Newport confirming that her daughter would marry Aristotle Onassis. No date given at first, no explanation. Reporters chartered fishing boats and pointed telephoto lenses at an island most Americans could not have found on a map. The reaction was not affectionate. The New York Times described the mood as anger, shock, and dismay. A German paper announced that America had lost a saint. The Washington Post ran a line about the gods weeping. Within days, the Vatican's own weekly L'Osservatore della Domenica called her a public sinner in an irregular situation under church law, and the Vatican's press chief said flatly that she had knowingly violated the law of the church. Cardinal Richard Cushing of Boston, the man who had married her to Jack in 1953 and buried him in 1963, called the excommunication talk nonsense, and asked why she couldn't marry whoever she wanted. He then spent weeks opening hate mail. He retired earlier than expected. So here's the first thing worth getting straight. The image we now file under glamour, Jackie O, the sunglasses, the yacht, the endless summer, was at the moment it happened, a national scandal. The soft focus version came later, and somebody built it. Now the harder question. Why would a 39-year-old woman with the most protected reputation in the United States trade it for a 62-year-old Greek shipping magnate with a live ex-wife and a famous mistress? The honest answer starts on the 6th of June, 1968, in a Los Angeles hospital, where Robert Kennedy died. Multiple people in her circle later recalled the same sentiment from her in the days after, in slightly different words. If they were killing Kennedys, her children were targets, and she wanted out of the country. The exact phrasing depends on which memoir you trust, and I treat the quotation loosely. The behavior, though, is documented and immediate. Within 4 months, she was married to a man who owned an island, a 100-meter yacht, and a private security apparatus. She was buying a wall. And here's the part almost nobody mentions, because it ruins the romance, and it ruins the greed narrative equally. The marriage canceled the protection she already had. Under federal rules, a president's widow keeps Secret Service coverage until she remarries. Jackie signed that away on her wedding day, along with her government widow's pension. She gave up American protection and purchased Greek protection, privately, with her own name as the currency. That's not a woman losing her head, that's a woman making a trade. Which brings up something people consistently get wrong about her. The public thought of Jacqueline Kennedy in 1968 as a beautiful, brittle, half-broken widow in a black veil. She was not. She was, by then, one of the most effective image operators in American public life, and she had already proven it twice. The first time was a week after Dallas. She summoned the journalist Theodore White to Hyannisport in the rain and gave him an interview for Life magazine. She did not talk about policy. She talked about her husband listening to a Broadway cast recording before bed, and she gave White the phrase, one brief, shining moment, Camelot. White's own handwritten notes, later deposited at the Kennedy Library and opened in the 90s, show her pushing the framing and show him letting her. Life ran it. The word stuck for 60 years. A grieving widow invented the most durable political brand of the 20th century in a single evening, on deadline. The second time was 1966. William Manchester had written The Death of a President with her cooperation, and when she saw what her own taped recollections looked like in print, she sued, publicly, against a book she had authorized. The suit settled in January 1967 with cuts to the text. She had recorded 10 hours of assassination testimony with Arthur Schlesinger that year, and sealed the rest of her oral history for decades. Keep that instinct in mind. Talk, then control the transcript. So when she started spending time with Aristotle Onassis, she was not naive about what he was. Nobody was. He had come out of Smyrna with nothing, built a tanker fleet, taken over Monaco's casino, run through Evita Peron, and a marriage to a shipping heiress named Tina Livanos. And in 1957 he had begun the affair that defined him, Maria Callas, the greatest soprano in the world. Tina divorced him over it in 1960. Callas left her own husband for him. 11 years of it, conducted in restaurants, in newspapers, on that yacht. Jackie first spent real time on the Christina in October 1963, 2 months after the death of her infant son Patrick. Her sister Lee Radziwill arranged the cruise. Lee was, by most accounts, involved with Onassis herself at the time. Jack Kennedy disliked the optics enough to send Undersecretary Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. along as cover. Bobby Kennedy, according to later accounts from people around him, told Jackie to keep her Greek friend away from the family until well after re-election. Jack was dead 5 weeks after she came home. Onassis was in Washington the night before the funeral, and he was invited into the house. That detail sits oddly in every version of this story. The man the Kennedys wanted at arm's length was inside the mourning circle before the president was buried. There was another man in that circle, and this is where the record gets genuinely good, because it is not gossip. It is her handwriting. David Ormsby Gore, Lord Harlech, had been British ambassador in Washington and one of Jack's closest friends. His wife was killed in a car crash in 1967. He and Jackie grew close. He proposed. She turned him down, and she explained why in a letter that nobody read for half a century, because it sat in a red leather case in a locked study at Glyn Cywarch, the family's house in Wales, until his grandson opened it. Bonham sold the collection in London in March 2017 for around $123,000. In it, she wrote that if she was ever to find healing and comfort, it had to be with somebody who was not part of all her world of past and pain. She added that she could find that now, if the world would let them. That is the motive, in her own hand, dated, before the fact. Not money, not madness. Exit. The world, for the record, did not let them. She also didn't tell anyone. Not her sister, Lee learned about the engagement from Onassis himself, and was reportedly devastated enough to unload the whole thing on Truman Capote, which is roughly the 1968 equivalent of publishing it. Onassis then invited Lee to the wedding. Callas, who had spent 11 years with him, read about it. Bobby had been the one trying hardest to stop it, and Bobby was in the ground. What replaced him was Ted. In September, Senator Edward Kennedy flew to Scorpios to talk terms with a shipping billionaire about his sister-in-law's future, a negotiation the family later described, when it described it at all as looking after her interests. Jackie's own financial advisor, Andre Meyer of Lazard, reworked whatever Ted came back with. Biographers have reported a lump sum in the low millions and an annual figure for widowhood, and the famous claim of a contract running to 170 clauses, covering everything down to sleeping arrangements. Be careful there. That clause count traces back to a 1970 book by a man who had worked on Onassis's crew and was selling a memoir, and the document has never surfaced. What we can verify is the negotiation happened, that lawyers on 2 continents ran it, and that the man she was about to marry treated the arrangement as a purchase. He told a friend the marriage would give him something no amount of money had bought yet. So the terms were set by her brother-in-law and a Wall Street banker, and the venue was set entirely by him. His island, his priest, his security, his guest list of about 20. On the 20th of October, in a whitewashed chapel called the Panayitsa, in rain, she wore a beige, lace-trimmed chiffon dress she had already worn to a friend's wedding earlier that year. Maxine Cheshire put a detail on the front page of the Washington Post that tells you more than the vows did. The bride wore flat heels to keep from towering over the groom. Caroline was 10. John was 7. They carried the candles. Then the guests boarded the yacht, the pink champagne came out, reporters bobbed offshore, and the marriage began exactly as it would continue, as a performance staged on somebody else's property. 4 days later, still aboard the Christina, she picked up a pen and wrote to a man in New York named Roswell Gilpatrick. Gilpatrick had been Deputy Secretary of Defense under Jack. He was a partner at Cravath, Swain, and Moore, 23 years older than she was, and by 1968 he and Jackie had been writing to each other for years in a register that his own third wife would eventually cite in separation papers. When the engagement hit the papers, reporters got to him first, and he told them he wished her the happiness she was certainly entitled to. So she wrote to explain herself. She told him she would have told him before she left, but everything had happened faster than she'd planned. It is a short note, and it is not the note of a woman in the middle of a honeymoon. She had no way of knowing that a young lawyer named Theodore Donson, who had worked at Gilpatrick's firm, would open a locked file cabinet and walk out with 4 of those letters. or that he would carry them to Charles Hamilton, the Manhattan autograph dealer who had auctioned Kennedy material before, or that Hamilton, as was his habit with anything Kennedy, would send copies straight to Maxine Cheshire at the Washington Post. Cheshire called Gilpatrick. Gilpatrick checked his cabinet, found it empty, and said the letters had obviously been taken by somebody with larceny in their heart. In February 1970, the Post published excerpts. 4 letters written between 1963 and 1968, 3 from the Kennedy years, and the one composed on her new husband's yacht, days into her new marriage, apologizing to another man for the way she'd handled it. Onassis read it the same week the rest of the world did. His response was not a confrontation, or at least not one anybody recorded. It was a reservation. He took Maria Callas to dinner at Maxim's in Paris, in public, and let the photographers do the rest. He had been seeing her throughout the marriage. His longtime personal secretary, Kiki Ferruti Moutsatsos, later said flatly that the two of them never stopped, though she was writing her own book about a man she adored, so take the emotional coloring with salt. The dinner, however, isn't testimony. It's a photograph. That is the whole marriage in one exchange. She humiliated him by accident. He humiliated her on purpose and made sure it was shot from the street. Something else had already gone wrong, quieter and more permanent. She had married for privacy and instead created the single most photographed woman on earth. The paparazzi gave her the nickname Jackie O, and one of them, Ron Galella, followed her so relentlessly that she eventually took him to federal court and won a restraining order in 1972, specifying how many feet he had to keep between them. 25 from her, 30 from the children. She had traded Secret Service agents for a court order and a measuring tape. Meanwhile, she was learning what she had actually married into, which was not a man so much as a corporation with a family attached. The physical map tells you the hierarchy. Scorpio's, his. The Christina, his. Named for his daughter. Apartments on Avenue Foch in Paris and in Athens, his. She kept the 15-room apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York, and she spent an enormous amount of time in it, alone. While he moved between continents on business he did not discuss with her. The money came monthly, and it came from him. Reports of the allowance vary. $30,000 a month reduced to $20,000 when she overspent is the figure that circulates most, sourced to biographers rather than to bank records. So treat the exact number as approximate. What's consistent across accounts is the structure, a fixed sum granted by a husband, adjusted downward as discipline. She responded to that the way a woman with no independent income and excellent taste responds. She bought couture, wore it once or twice, and resold it. Quietly, through intermediaries, for cash that was hers. Friends found it eccentric. It was not eccentric. It was a woman with no salary building a private balance out of the only asset she was permitted to accumulate. Look at what she was doing there, because it comes back. Then there were his children, who did not want her and never pretended otherwise. Christina Onassis, 20 at the wedding, reportedly called her the gold digger, and would not soften. Alexander, 20, had watched his mother lose his father to Callas, and now watched Callas lose him to an American widow. He was not hostile in a dramatic way. He was simply certain his father had made a fool of himself. And yet, and this is the part that keeps the story from being a cartoon, there was something real in the house when the man was actually in it. Jackie's assistant, Kathy McKeon, who was in the household daily, described evenings that sound almost aggressively ordinary. The two of them sitting together with drinks, Jiffy Pop popcorn, Onassis at the dinner table asking Caroline and John about school, paying attention, and being loved back for it. McKeon's account is a former employee's memoir published decades later, but it is specific and unglamorous, and nothing else in the record contradicts it. He was good to her children. He took 2 kids whose father had been shot in front of their mother and gave them an island to run around on, without agents. Whatever else the marriage was, it was that for a while. The pattern was still the pattern. He traveled, Callas remained. Jackie went months without seeing him, and filled the time with New York, with friends, with art, with Doris Duke's Newport Restoration Foundation, where she'd been made a vice president in 1968. Separate lives, coordinated appearances, a merger with a public relations arm. By 1972, people around both of them understood the marriage as functionally finished and formally intact. Neither had a reason to move. Divorce would cost her money and cost him face, and both of them had spent decades being extremely good at maintaining a version of events. Then, on the 22nd of January 1973, A light aircraft crashed on takeoff from Athens airport, and Alexander Onassis, 24 years old, died the following day. His father did not recover from it. Not in any sense. He flew in specialists, he pursued theories of sabotage for the rest of his life. He had the body kept, then buried on Scorpios beside the chapel where his wife had married him. And he began, according to people around him, to talk about his American wife as the reason. The language reported is ugly and consistent across sources hostile to Jackie and sources sympathetic to Callis alike. That he called her a witch, that he said she carried a curse, that he counted the dead, Jack, Bobby, and now his son. Christina, who had lost her brother and would lose her mother that October, agreed enthusiastically. The most quoted version of this comes from Ariana Stassinopoulos' biography of Callis, which is not a neutral document. It is a book about the woman Onassis should have married. But the practical consequences of his belief are visible without any of the quotations. He stopped defending the marriage. He started dismantling it. He hired Roy Cohn, Joseph McCarthy's former counsel, then Manhattan's most useful attack lawyer, to handle a divorce. Cohn told that story himself years later, and Cohn was a man who improved every story he was in, so hold it lightly. What isn't in dispute is that Onassis wanted the ending to be public and wanted it to cost her. Stassinopoulos' phrase, that he intended to make it as humiliating as possible for her, was reported widely enough by 1981 to run on the wires. He also began feeding the press. Items appeared about his wife's spending. Numbers, dates, receipts, in the kind of detail that only comes from inside a household. She had spent 5 years being photographed, and had never once responded to a story about herself. She didn't respond to these either. Instead, in January 1974, while his lawyers were still circling, Onassis sat down aboard the Christina and wrote out a document in his own hand. It is the single most revealing object in this entire marriage, and almost nobody has read it because it reads like a contract and not like a scandal. He left his wife an annual payment. The figure generally reported is $250,000 a year, with a portion carved out for Caroline and John, against a fortune estimated in the hundreds of millions. And then he did the thing that shows exactly how the marriage had ended in his mind, he wrote, in that she had waived her rights under Greek inheritance law, and he instructed his executors to fight her, at the estate's expense, if she ever challenged it. He didn't just cut her down, he anticipated her, and pre-funded the war. Greek law at the time guaranteed a widow a fixed share of an estate regardless of what the will said. Onassis' own lawyers knew it. He knew it. That codicil exists because a dying man understood precisely what his wife would do the moment he was gone, and wanted to lose to her as slowly and as expensively as possible. He never filed for the divorce. Within months he was visibly ill, diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, the muscles of his face failing so obviously that he took to taping his eyelids open. In February 1975, he was flown to Paris and admitted to the American hospital in Neuilly. Jackie stayed with him for a period, then flew home to New York. He died on the 15th of March. His daughter Christina was at the hospital. His wife was in Manhattan, and she came back to Paris afterward, and the photographers were waiting for the thing they had been promised for 6 years. The widow, again, in black. She gave them something else entirely. She came out of the American hospital and she was smiling. That photograph ran everywhere, and it was read, uniformly, as vulgar. The woman who had knelt at a state funeral in a veil now stood outside a Paris hospital with her second husband dead upstairs, looking something close to relieved. Christina Onassis stood a few feet away in genuine grief, and the contrast was not lost on a single editor in Europe. Then Jackie issued a statement, and it was a small masterpiece. Onassis, she said, had rescued her at a moment when her life was shadowed with tragedy, and he had brought her into a world where she could find both happiness and love. She used the word love. She used the word rescued. She said nothing that could be checked against anything. 6 weeks earlier, her husband had been paying Roy Cohn to destroy her in open court. Now watch what she actually did, because this is the moment the supposedly passive woman stops being anybody's widow. Onassis was buried on Scorpios beside Alexander. The will was read, and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who had never publicly contradicted a rumor in her life, went straight at the estate. Her lawyers made the argument he had already predicted in his own handwriting, that Greek law entitled a widow to a fixed share of the estate no matter what a testator wrote, and that the annual allowance fell far short of it. Ted Kennedy worked the negotiation from behind, as he had in 1968. The same brother-in-law, the same island, the same adversary's family, 7 years later, on considerably better terms. Christina fought for a year and a half. Her attorney, Stelios Papadimitriou, who had represented the Onassis family since 1954, later told reporters that his client settled mainly to be rid of her stepmother and to avoid a Greek courtroom that her own lawyers believed Jackie would win outright. The reported settlement was around $26 million, with figures between 20 and 26 circulating depending on who was counting and how the children's portions were treated. In exchange, Jackie surrendered every remaining claim on the estate, and the two women never spoke again. Onassis had written the codicil to guarantee a fight. He got one. He lost it posthumously to a woman he had spent his last year calling a curse. She was 45, she had no husband, no title, and for the first time since 1953, no institution attached to her name. She had a 15-room apartment on Fifth Avenue and roughly $26 million. In the summer of 1975, she took a job. The salary was $200 a week. Consulting editor at Viking Press, arranged through Tom Ginsberg, an old friend. She was 46 years old, and it was her first employment in 22 years. Reporters treated it as a whim, a rich woman playing at work, and she gave Newsweek an answer that has aged extremely well. She'd been a reporter herself, she'd lived through important parts of American history, and she wasn't the worst choice for the position. She lasted 2 years at Viking, and she left over the thing you'd expect her to leave over. In 1977, the House published Jeffrey Archer's novel Shall We Tell the President, a thriller built around an assassination plot against Ted Kennedy. When the press implied she'd known and approved, she resigned. Ginsberg's recollection and hers conflict on the details. He remembered mentioning it to her. She said she'd heard about it from friends at rival houses, and both accounts were given years later to the same biographer, so you can pick your witness. What isn't ambiguous is the exit. She had spent 14 years controlling how the Kennedy assassination appeared in print. She was not going to have her name on a novel about the next one. In early 1978, she went to Doubleday, and she stayed 19 years, until the end of her life. Her starting salary was $20,000. She worked out of a small office without a window. She edited close to 100 books: Diana Vreeland, George Plimpton, Bill Moyers, Naguib Mahfouz, Dorothy West. She commissioned the first commercially successful book about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. She published Kelsey Kirkland's Attack on Balanchine and Michael Jackson's Moonwalk, and she sat on floors arranging layouts. She never wrote a memoir, not one page, offered enormous sums, and refused all of them. Consider what that means from a woman who spent 2 decades in publishing. She knew exactly what her own story was worth, and she deliberately kept it off the market while spending every working day putting other people's lives into print. That is not silence. That is inventory control, and it explains the shape of everything that came after. Because the story you have heard your whole life about her second marriage, the greedy widow, the ruined saint, the sunglasses, the gold digging, is a story assembled almost entirely out of hostile or interested testimony. A crewman selling a memoir, a biographer writing on behalf of Maria Callas, Roy Cohn improving, Christina who despised her, secretaries and chauffeurs decades on, remembering conversations nobody wrote down. The material that came from Jackie is different in kind. Contemporary, handwritten, dated, and almost all of it surfaced by accident or after her death. The Gilpatrick letters, stolen. The Ormsby Gore letters, forgotten in a Welsh study for 30 years. The Schlesinger tapes, sealed until Caroline released them in 2011. She did not defend herself once. She simply made sure that when the record eventually opened, it would be in her handwriting and nobody else's. She died in her apartment on the 19th of May, 1994, of lymphoma at 64. Maurice Templesman, the diamond dealer who had been her companion for the last decade and had managed the Onassis money into something like $100 million, was in the apartment. Her will left nothing to any Onassis. She was buried at Arlington, beside John Kennedy, beside the infant son who died in 1963, and the daughter who was stillborn in 1956, read what's cut into the stone. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis. All 4 names. She lies for eternity next to the president, in the National Cemetery, under the name of the Greek shipping magnate. The country had never forgiven her for marrying. She could have dropped it. Nobody would have blinked. She kept it, because it was hers, bought with 5 years of scandal, 1 stolen letter, a husband who spent his last winter trying to ruin her, and a settlement she extracted from his daughter over 18 months of litigation. Now go back to the chapel in the rain. The candles are held by two children who had already buried their father, standing in a building on an island the groom owned, where the guest list was his, and the priest was his, and the bride wore flat shoes so she wouldn't outsize him. Everything in that frame belonged to Aristotle Onassis, except the woman at the center of it. And she had just signed away Secret Service protection to be there. It was never a fairy tale, and it was never a fleecing. It was an evacuation, negotiated by a senator, financed by a ship owner, and executed by a woman who had understood since Hyannisport in 1963 that the version people remember is simply the version somebody bothered to write down. He wrote the will. She wrote the ending.